we're gonna start the next session. If you're just coming in, let's have a seat. I'm Bean Kim. I work at Google Brain, and I'll be a session chair for interpretability and explainability. I want to start the session by thanking Latanya for advertising this session in her discussion with Jason, where she said transparency, transparency, and transparency. The field of interpretability is about making machine learning models understandable to humans by explaining it using human understandable language. And this is hard because in the rise of complex models like deep learning, even the creators of the model don't really understand why things work. Well, why is it 5 layers and not 7? Well, we removed some layers and it worked better. So it's a hard problem, but increasingly we've been seeing last couple of years exciting progress and research, and it is becoming focus for a lot of our topic of research. I'm really excited for this session. We have 3 awesome talks. We're going to start with Andrew, who will talk to us about meaningful information and the right to explanation.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm presenting this paper, Meaningful Information and the Right to Explanation, which is work I did with Julia Powles of Cornell Tech and NYU Information Law Institute. So the first part of my talk got preempted a little bit. Why do we care about explanations? From a legal perspective, and I'll preface this by saying this is actually a legal talk, so bear with me if you're not that interested in law, but you should be. Why explanations? So generally, when we think about law, we think about what is inexplicable being unaccountable. And what we want is ultimately accountability. So the worry, the panic, as it were, is that there would be mysterious machines making decisions about all our lives. We would have alien knowledge guiding us that we couldn't possibly understand. Artificial intelligence could be totally inscrutable, and again, thus unaccountable. So, in 2016, Europe passed a new omnibus piece of legislation called the General Data Protection Regulation. Among the parts of this legislation, which covers what you might call privacy, what you might call profiling, various other things that I'll get to in a second, they were worried about automated decision making. And what this talk is asking whether there is, and trying to answer, whether there is a right to explanation embedded in the actual GDPR. Now, a lot of what legal scholarship does is try to figure out ambiguous terms, what they actually mean, and how they should be interpreted in light of the goals of a statute, for example. So a lot of this is going to be looking at, frankly, walls of text, and I apologize in advance, but we really have to talk through the specifics of what some of these words in the statute might mean. But first we should start with what the GDPR is and what it's trying to do. So it is an omnibus piece of data protection regulation. In Europe, data protection is considered a fundamental right. It's pretty important. This legislation is based on what was called the Data Protection Directive. That was a directive passed in 1995. The difference between a directive and a regulation is that a directive, it offers a framework for which the European member states must pass laws to be in accordance with it, whereas a regulation is law that applies to each of the member states. Therefore, one of the main goals of the GDPR was harmonization of data protection law across Europe to make it all one piece of law. It was also better protection because, frankly, some of the laws in some of the member states weren't that good, and they care about data protection. And then it's stronger incentives. So one of the big deal things that all the companies are really worried about is that if you piss off the European regulators, i.e. if you break this law, you could get up to 4% of global revenue in fines. That's a lot. So one might call that better incentives. The hot topics of this law are data portability. There's a new right to data portability. The right to be forgotten had been read into the law before and now is explicit. The right to profiling. Rights against profiling, there's an emphasis on profiling that wasn't there before. And what we're saying, the right to explanation, is newer. There was something before about automated decision making, but it was a lot looser. So here are the different provisions. There are 3 provisions in the GDPR that focus on automated decision making. The first, where everyone starts, is Article 22. Again, wall of text, forgive me. I'm going to walk you through what you need to know. You don't need to read this whole thing. Focus on what I'm saying. So the Article 22.1 is a general ban on automated processing in certain situations. That is, when it's solely automated processing. The Article 29 Working Party, a body built to help interpret European law, has suggested that this means when a human has the chance to alter the decision, it is not solely based on automated processing. It also asks about legal effects that significantly similar effects on data subjects. So these are limitations built into Article 22. We'll get back to that. Article 22.2 says that the ban actually looks a lot more like Swiss cheese than it looks like a ban. There are a bunch of holes, reasons you can do automated processing. Article 22.3 says, okay, when the Swiss cheese is activated, what you actually need to do are put safeguards in place. And some of those safeguards are the right to obtain human intervention, the right to contest the decision. I'm not going to talk about Article 22.4. Articles 13 to 15 are information rights that data subjects have. So 13 and 14 are notifications that data controllers have to give you upon obtaining and processing personal data or other non-personal data, or non-sensitive data. Anyway, point is, you have to be given this information. Article 15 is a right of access where you can request the information as a data subject. They all have this same provision when it comes to automated decision making. It requires that the data subject have access to the existence of automated decision making, including profiling, and this is the important part, meaningful information about the logic involved, as well as the significance and envisaged consequences of such processing for the data subject. The last part is also probably important, not going to talk about it. Next, sorry, I'm also speaking really fast. I don't know what to do. Recital 71. So in European law, recitals are non-binding, right? So the way they work, they help interpret, they help co-determine positive law, but they are not themselves law in the binding sense. Recital 71 here modifies Article 22 by saying the right to obtain an explanation of the decision reached after such assessment and challenge the decision is one of the suggested suitable safeguards. There are a few others that repeat a lot of the language from Article 22. This means a right to explanation. The only time it is literally mentioned in the GDPR is in this recital. So in that sense, it's non-binding. So if there is a right to explanation, it's got to come from somewhere else. So where does it come from? There's a lot of argument about this. Goodman and Flaxman started with a paper, sort of explain it for more of a technical audience, saying it came from Recital 71. That was the conference version. They have different versions now. It doesn't come from Recital 71, and eventually they corrected that and didn't really have a long discussion of Articles 13 and 14. Sandra Wachter, Brent Mittelstadt, and Luciano Floridi said, no, it's not Recital 71 because it's not binding. They said it's also not Article 22, therefore it cannot exist. But later in the paper, they also say there's a right to explanation. They just call it a right to information. So I don't really understand what that is. To tell you the truth, we were writing this paper partially as a response to theirs. If you read the paper that is published in the journal, it goes into a lot more of discussion of their paper, but I'm not going to talk about it here. Mendoza and Bygrave have another paper where they point to a right to explanation that comes from Article 22.3's right to contest a decision. Their idea is, look, how do you contest it if you don't know what the decision is, right? On what basis can you possibly contest it? There has to be a hidden right, a right of explanation in there, which I kind of buy that. But that's not the point we're making. The point we're making is that meaningful information about the logic involved in automated processing has to mean a right to explanation of some sort, because I don't literally know what else it could possibly mean. So returning to the text, right, we want to ask, what does meaningful information mean? And if you look at the different translations, for example, they all sort of invoke notions of utility, reliability, understandability. So it seems to be something like a useful explanation, something functional. And so our recommendations, actually, before we get to the recommendations, there's support for a right to explanation that comes from somewhere else from other provisions. So Article 22 doesn't give you the right to explanation. But if you imagine that it comes from somewhere else, you can see that the right to obtain human intervention, to express the point of view, to contest the decision, all supposes that there is an explanation sitting somewhere already, and you can use it. Recital 71, it's the same thing. The safeguards talk about extra things you can do. And Articles 5 and 12 talk about fair, transparent, intelligible data processing as a general theme of what the GDPR requires. And so these all fit into the idea that there should be a right to explanation somewhere. So our recommendations. The meaning of meaningful information. It has to be meaningful to the data subject. It comes from the data subject rights. So that's clear, everyone agrees on that. The last three we want to talk about though are functional, or that the explanation should be functional, it should be it should enable vindication of rights, and it should be flexible. So I'm going to explain those real quick. Broadly, you could think of three different reasons for explanation. One is inherent good, right? Dignity, autonomy, personhood, avoiding living in a Kafkaesque world. That's really important, that's really valuable, and it motivates a lot of European law in particular, but it's kind of hard to benchmark, right? What is a good enough explanation? How do you make a law out of that? I don't know the answer. So thinking of those translations that suggest useful information, we want to talk about more enabling action in data subjects or creating an opportunity to challenge the kinds of decisions to vindicate something. And what makes a good enough explanation? Well, the thing you're trying to vindicate are substantive rights under the GDPR and under human rights law. You want to be able to see if you've been discriminated against, and if you have, to challenge it in court. Right? That's what the explanation's doing for you. And the last point is that you want a flexible explanation. So a lot of the interpretability research on the computer science side is about types of explanation. The legal people are starting to get into this too. So you could think of, on the technical side, rule extraction, right? Models of models, where you turn deep learning into a decision tree. Or building simpler models to start, where you look at it and know what's going on. You have outcome explanations, like some of the researchers in the room developed LIME, where it says this is the reason for this particular outcome. A lot of the legal research has started to focus more on outcomes, but there are different types of outcome-based decisions. There's distance functions from the ideal candidate, distance functions from a surface in which you would have gotten a different outcome, right? There's principal factors. So in the US, we have credit laws that require adverse action notices. They require a listing of the principal factors that went into a decision. Our answer for what the GDPR requires is who cares? It's functional, it vindicates rights. We don't care about the form. Make it flexible. Just don't mandate that it looks like something, because the whole point is it's trying to achieve something. Measure by what it's trying to achieve. So the last thing is, what about uninterpretable machine learning? What about deep learning? What does this do? It doesn't make deep learning illegal. So this is where Article 22 has these limits, right? It's a decision solely based on automated processing. You can have a prediction and then have a whole separate architecture of a human deciding what to do with that prediction. That's very different than making deep learning illegal. It's also only when there are legal or similarly significant effects on the data subject. So all these like business-to-business models, they're not going to apply here. And there are going to be all sorts of things that don't necessarily apply. But where Article 22 does apply, if the explanation is not possible, then either you can't use the technique or you do so at your own peril. At a certain point, the law is the law. And remember those 4% fines? They're going to start to matter. So summing up. Europe treats data protection as a fundamental right, and GDPR is a big deal. Based on the GDPR's overall objectives, meaningful information should be read as a requirement for functional, flexible explanations that help vindicate substantive rights under the GDPR and human rights law. And if explanation is not achievable, you use the kind of technique at your own peril. Thank you. Oh, one last thing. Sorry, one last thing. The paper is published in a journal, so we were one of the 2 non-archival papers here. So if you wanted to find it, here is the citation. And yeah, that's all I got.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I'm a GDPR dilettante, but my general understanding, it seems like most of the action has been taking place over this Chapter 3 kind of issues on, is there actually this?
Can't hear you.
Is that better? Okay. Whether there's actually this right to explanation in the text of the GDPR itself. I saw briefly, I think, on your slide the sort of allusion to A29WP and the sort of Chapter 6, Chapter 8 issue of, hey, we give these sort of DPAs these really broad, sweeping powers, and via this A29WP, they've issued fairly substantive guidance that seems to suggest there really is this fairly profound right to explanation. So I'm curious how much you think we should just be focused on the A29WP issue and their particular guidance sort of trickling down to the SAs and DPAs versus actually looking at the text and the sort of linguistic analysis in GDPR.
Well, thanks for the question. I'm going to tell you, I'm not a European lawyer, and so part of it's a hard sort of predictive measure to say who's going to matter in terms of regulators. I think people are going to key off the Article 29 Working Party guidance in terms of what they think it means. DPAs could very well have a very different idea, and in member states could do something about that very different idea. What I didn't actually say that I should have, GDPR comes into effect May 25th of this year, so actually we have no, it's not even in effect yet. So we don't know what the subsequent interpretations and enforcement actions are going to look like. There's going to be a lot of development in this field, and we'll get answers in the next few years, but we really don't know the answer to that question.
Hey, hi Andrew. Thanks a lot for your presentation. First of all, just to start off by maybe trying to defend Brent and Sandra, since they're not here defending themselves, is I think that their paper does, I think the distinction it's making is ex ante ex post rather than saying that the right doesn't exist altogether. In that context, I just thought I'd ask you if you feel that maybe the interpretation that you're taking in the paper makes the term meaningful do a little too much work, and B, given that the final guidelines that the Article 29 Working Party has adopted, which says that the Article 15 right is essentially on system functionality rather than explainability of specific decisions. I just thought I'd get your thoughts also on what you think of their interpretation in clarifying what the explanation is actually meant to cover. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. So, I mean, I'm not going to, we have a long, about half the paper is dedicated to answering that question, so I'll defer somewhat to that. I would say that I think it's right that it's asking for the logic of the system. You know, I tend to divide between outcomes and logic, and system functionality is sort of the logic of the system. I totally agree with that. I just think that if you have the logic of the system and you have the input data, you usually have the outcome as well, or can calculate it. And so it's hard to make that distinction in any sort of principled way a lot of the time. And I don't necessarily buy the ex ante ex post thing. Again, read the paper. But thank you.
Hi, Andrew. I think there's a couple of points. One of them that I don't think is really mentioned in the paper very much. The GDPR is a risk-based regulation in many parts, and Article 24 is really important in this regard. And it says when there are higher risks to process to data subjects, you really have higher obligations in the face of technical and organizational difficulties for data controllers. And meaningful doesn't just relate to the data subject necessarily, but it also will be mediated by the burden on the data controller, the technical difficulty of undertaking such an explanation, and so on. And so I was wondering what you think about expanding meaningful to also be in relation to the complexity of the task and the risks the data controller is taking with data subjects' rights and freedoms, rather than just utility.
Right, thank you for that. I think that makes sense, right? If you have to operationalize these things, you're gonna have to trade off benefits. I think what Julia and I were trying to do is suggest that if the GDPR is going to try to accomplish what it says it wants to accomplish in terms of these aspirational goals of fair, transparent, intelligible processing, this should be the focus of what meaningful information means. Ultimately, there are going to be things that push back on that interpretation. We're offering this, and I think you're right, in practice, it's going to be a trade-off of what companies are able to do. But they can also choose to use different kinds of learning systems, different kinds of, I don't know, like technological systems in general. And so saying we already have this system, it's therefore a huge burden to re-architect our system, is not something I have a ton of sympathy with, given a lot of what the GDPR is trying to accomplish is telling companies they have to re-architect their systems and get over it.
Thanks, Andrew. This is an amazing talk. I have a million questions. I'll just ask one. You say that in Article 22 it says that people should not be subject to decision based solely on automated processing. Does that mean supervised machine learning is okay because you use annotations that humans might provide?
According to the Article 29 Working Party, there has to have been a human that could have changed the outcome. I don't know any more than that. I think, honestly, it's going to be open to interpretation what solely means. I think if you interpret it strictly, it makes Article 22 a nullity, right? Because there's nothing exists without human involvement in some way, and it never will. So, but they wouldn't have written this provision in and they certainly could have taken it out. I mean, it was in the Data Protection Directive and was often kind of ignored. So they could have, I guess, just gotten rid of it. But just because it was ignored in the previous iteration of the law doesn't mean it will be now, and certainly there's a lot more interest around it now. And they could have written it a different way, but so it's just not clear what solely means. It's certainly meant to be a limitation, but we'll see.